Focus on Aging Adults is sponsored in part by AARP.
Pennsylvania has one of the largest aging populations in the country. Our aging adults are vibrant, active contributors to our society. PCN, in partnership with AARP, present Focus on Aging Adults.
Welcome to Focus on Aging Adults. I'm Larry Casper. This program is brought to you in partnership between PCN and the AARP of Pennsylvania. Today we're talking about how voters age 50 and older can influence the outcome of the November general election. The AARP of Pennsylvania commissioned a poll on this subject. It was conducted by Bob Ward of Fabricio Ward and Jeff List from Impact Research. We also have Bill Johnston Walsh, the state director of the AARP of Pennsylvania. Bill, let's consider a profile of the average older voter. How can their concerns and priorities change as they age?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, at AARP, we do have a whole array. Our membership starts at 50. So we go from 50 on up. So you will see, especially in this poll we're going to be talking about later, that the 50 to 64-year-olds have a different mindset than the 65 plus. And they're at different places in their life. They're still in the workforce for the most part, still raising their families compared to the retirees that might be at the 65 plus. At AARP, we really wanted to look at the importance of the issues that are impacting our membership here, as well as the 50 plus voters across the Commonwealth. We have looked at, as in past years, the polls that we really want to do in the election cycles, and we found that in 2020, 55% of the voters in Pennsylvania were over the age of 50. Then when we looked at 2022, we noticed that 62% were over the age of 50 in that election cycle. And we know, and you'll hear more about that it's even going to be larger this election cycle. And so we wanted the candidates to know the importance of this. We also wanted to know, let Pennsylvanians know what's on the minds of the 50 plus here in the state. What are some of the key issues that are impacting them on a day-to-day basis? And we, the bread and butter, the table talk kind of issues that are impacting them, and we really wanted to be able to lay that out for the 50 plus as well as for the candidates.
Bob, that does sound significant that 62% of the electorate in 2022 were older voters, and talk about just how important that is to how things turn out here in Pennsylvania.
Sure. Well, 2022 was a midterm election. Turnout is a bit lower. And what happens in midterm elections is younger people are even less likely to turn out, which makes that bulge every 2 years for 50 plus voters. But for this election cycle, presidential year, where more people do turn out, we're still expecting to see 50 plus voters make up a sizable portion, majority of the electorate. Our poll put it at around 55%. But we have some questions in our poll that show that older voters are more motivated, younger voters are less motivated. So they could actually be, much bigger. There's some demographics involved too. I mean, the baby boom generation is taking up a big space of this part of the electorate, and they're just larger than previous generations. And politically they're different too. But we'll get into that when we talk about the poll a little bit.
Jeff, help us get inside the average mind of the average older voter. In other words, just what are they thinking about in a general sense?
Well, I think that one of the findings of the survey, which we'll get into later, is that older voters are a diverse group, and they have a lot of different concerns. There are differences, as Bill mentioned, between 50 to 64 and 65 plus. I think one thing I would flag is that as you age, what you mean when you volunteer an issue to a pollster and say the economy is the most important thing or healthcare is the most important thing can change. And a lot of these older voters, as we'll see, our family caregivers. A lot of them are really concerned by the ability of the elderly to age in place, in addition to traditional concerns among older voters like Social Security and Medicare.
Mm-hmm. Let's consider, Bill, what's the significance of being an older voter in Pennsylvania? In other words, I imagine it's different than being an older voter in another state, because maybe you have different resources here.
Well, I think I can't compare us to other states, but what I can talk about is the older voter here in Pennsylvania. And in the Commonwealth, what we've seen over the years, especially this year, is where a majority of Pennsylvanians don't really start thinking about the election until after Labor Day. It's really not on their radar screen. Mm-hmm. They don't really think about it. If they do, it's in sound bites here and there. Mm-hmm. But the older voter, the 50-plus voter, basically is paying attention every day because it impacts them. It impacts them, with regards to, their Social Security and what's happening with that. And do candidates care about making sure that Social Security stays solvent as we go forward? Mm-hmm. They look at healthcare issues. They look, as Jeff said, about livable communities, about, aging in place. I have this home. I have property tax I have to pay on it. I have utilities. I have upkeep. I want to keep my home. What are candidates going to be doing at, the federal, state, and local level for me to make sure that I can age in place? I can be with my family as long as possible in the setting that I want to be in.
Bob, in general, as you get older, as you know, you use more health care services, of course. So what were some of the issues you came up when you were conducting this poll? And we're going to get into those numbers soon.
Well, sure. We asked voters, how important things like Medicare are in terms of determining their vote. And they're very important. Majorities, and it doesn't matter what political party you are, Republican, Independent, or Democrat, issues like Social Security and Medicare, healthcare, are, 70+% saying they would, that issue will have an impact on how they decide their vote. So big issues. Social Security becomes Social Security and Medicare become bigger issues on the older side of the 50+ electorate, 65+. But healthcare certainly is an issue for all voters. And is a big issue for those in the 50 to 64-year-old segment as well, who are, often in what we call the sandwich generation of still raising kids, but taking care of their parents. And as Jeff mentioned, this family caregiving issue is a big issue that candidates need to be taking, be aware of. 27% of Pennsylvania voters are family caregivers. That's voters 50+. That's a big chunk of the electorate.
So, Jeff, candidates can't forget about the caregivers because they're a substantial part of the electorate out there.
That's right. They are more than a quarter of the voters age 50+. They're an especially large part of the age group 50 to 64, which is a really important group, as we'll get into when we talk about the poll. But I think it's also important to note that not only will a majority of the voters in Pennsylvania be over age 50 in this election, but Pennsylvania is likely the most important state in the entire country this year. Pennsylvania in the polls right now looks like the likeliest state to be the tipping point and decide the election. And again, within that state, a majority of the voters will be over age 50. So these concerns are especially important for candidates to address.
Gentlemen, let's start talking about the poll that was just done in April then. So, Bill, when AARP commissioned the poll, what was the basic plan going into it? What were you trying to find out?
Well, several things. One is we just really wanted to see where the 50+ voter was, what their thoughts are, what the most important issues for them going forward are. Do they align with some of the things that we've been talking about at AARP? We also wanted to know, what are some of the horse race numbers? Who's leading and why? And why in this poll are they getting the votes? And what issues are of concern? So it's really been that aspect of it. We wanted to have a baseline right after the primary, and then we would have another another poll in October that basically will look at it again and see what has changed over time. Have the issues, priorities changed? Have the numbers or who you're going to vote for changed? So we really wanted to be able to see that. And then also be able to let Pennsylvanians know, as Jeff said, we are the most important state. I'd like to think we are always on a whole bunch of issues, but on when it comes to elections, and especially the most recent elections, Pennsylvania has been in the forefront.
Bob, how did you select people to participate in this poll?
Well, so let's explain what we did. We have a number of samples that we're looking at here. We've got a 600 sample likely voters age 18 plus of the state. So that gives us sort of a holistic view of the election as it stands with everybody. We have an additional sample of 800 Pennsylvania likely voters age 50 plus. And we also did an oversample of Black voters 50 plus. We have got a sample of 400 Black voters 50 plus. So how do we sample these folks? We start with the voter list. So everyone that we're who's going to be a candidate to take our survey is a registered voter, and we contact people in 3 different ways. We use live interviewers to contact them via landline telephones. We use live interviewers to contact them via mobile phones, and we use text to web, which is, we have your phone number from the voter file. We will send a text, and you can click on a link and take the survey online. We have to do this because the way we communicate with one another changes from year to year rapidly. There's very few people who have, only a landline phone anymore. But there are people who only have a landline phone, and so we need to sample them. But most people have cell phones, and most of our interviews are done over cell phones. And then younger people, well, they don't answer their cell phone, but they may respond to a text, and that's why we have text to web. So it's sort of our business is evolving as we evolve in how we communicate. And this is AARP has invested in a very high quality way to conduct survey research. It's how our firm conducts survey research for our own political clients when, it's our campaigns on the line. So it's pretty good research that AARP has put together in Pennsylvania.
And what we keep on hearing about, especially the polls that we've done in the past and this poll, is twofold. One is that it's bipartisan. We have both Bob and Jeff and their firms doing it for us. And then the second piece is that it's a large number. It's over 1,300 individuals that have been doing this. So we hear from the media, we hear from influencers, from the candidates themselves in their camps, that they look at ours and they take it to heart because they know it's not just a couple hundred people they're interviewing and then just surmising off of that. It's really a larger number, and it's also very bipartisan.
So Jeff, tell us as a pollster then, how did you know how big a sample to take in order for it to be representative? And Bill said it was more than 1,300 people. How did you know to make the sample that big?
Right, that's a good question. You want to make sure that you have enough interviews that when you are talking about a subgroup of those interviews, like say men, women, or a particular age group, or white versus black, or urban versus rural, that you're not talking about such a small group out of your total sample that it doesn't really mean anything. So we conducted this 600 interview base sample, which is a good size statewide sample. But then, as Bob mentioned, there were groups that we wanted to be able to talk about in a lot more detail, especially older voters 50 plus and Black voters 50 plus. And so what you ended up getting here through this mixed mode approach is a real gold standard look at not only the state writ large through the main sample of the 600 interviews, but a great look within older voters at men, women, 50 to 64 versus 65 plus, urban, rural, suburban, right? All of these subgroups that we wanted to look at by getting the extra interviews among older voters.
So party affiliation, that occurs to me as another subgroup that you would consider, and maybe some people who participated in the poll didn't even have a party affiliation.
That's right. That's right. We tend to focus on how the Democrats and the Republicans differ, but it's also true on a lot of issues that the independents may be closer to one side or closer to the other, and that matters a lot. And I think it also matters a lot that not all of these older voters that we're talking about are straight ticket Democrats or Republicans. You've got almost 30% of voters 50 plus who are not voting a straight ticket on the various races that we ask them about. So not only are voters 50 plus going to turn out in large numbers and be a majority of the electorate, but there are a lot of them that are persuadable by the candidates.
So gentlemen, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the poll that you took and talk about the most important issues that would determine an older person's vote. And start at the top of the list, Bob. What did you find?
So what this poll clearly tells us is that the economy is a huge issue in Pennsylvania, and it's a huge issue across America. We look at issues like inflation and rising prices, the economy and jobs, Social Security. These are all personal economic issues, and when you put them together, they really speak to what the voters are feeling in Pennsylvania. It's the economy. There are other issues, for sure. You look at immigration and border security is a big issue. As a single issue, it's at the top of our list, but it is an issue that really is important to the right of the electorate among Republicans.
Bob and Jeff, did you ask the voters why they specified immigration and border security as a concern? Did they get any more specific?
That was not part of the survey. So we have it as something, and we know who mostly thinks it's a concern. Like I said, it's Republican voters. Just as, when you have Democratic voters who are, they have abortion, reproductive rights higher on their list. Threats to democracy are higher among Democrats. So, where you are, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, these issues are not all the same across all groups, with the exception of economic issues, which is at the top of everyone's list.
So let's go back to threats to democracy, gentlemen, because I have no recollection of that appearing on any previous poll. And naturally, all of us are aware of the riot that took place at the Capitol on January 6th. Did that seem to be an unusual outcome to have this cited as a concern?
It's certainly a new concern that you wouldn't have seen before the aftermath of the 2020 election. But just as Bob pointed out, that it's mainly Republicans that are driving concern over immigration, it's mainly Democrats, and mainly older Democrats, actually, who are driving concern over protecting democracy. And actually, it's been showing up in the list of most important issues pretty consistently since the January 6th riot. But again, it's mostly driven by older Democrats. If you look at the Democrats 50 plus, I think it was 27% of them that volunteered protecting democracy, and most other groups were sort of in the low to sort of maybe the low double digits.
So let's talk about the issue of abortion and reproductive issues. And it occurs to me that this is being viewed through an older person's lens, and they may have raising families in their past. That's something they've already done. And yet their concern continues.
Yeah, for sure. Abortion, reproductive rights, especially among women, and it doesn't matter if you're under or over 50. This is an important issue that we see come up, particularly among Democratic women. And so in states where it's the policies are in flux, it may see this being even higher importance. But it is one of those cultural issues that is definitely going to have a play in how people cast their vote in November.
And what we see here on the ground in Pennsylvania has been, it's really suburban women, especially around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, that some of these issues really raise to the top. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican in those circles, that reproductive rights is a key issue, as well as as economic issues. Social Security and healthcare and caregiving have all been issues wrapped around that, around women, 50-plus women in the suburbs.
Now, let's move on to another question that appeared on your poll, gentlemen. And the question simply was, how motivated are you to vote? Jeff, get us started on the results there.
Well, this is a question where you have enormous differences between older voters over 50 and younger voters under 50. So if you ask this on a 10-point scale, where 0 or 1 to 10, how motivated are you to vote? And 10 means you're extremely motivated to vote, and a 1 means you're not motivated at all. We tend to look at what percentage of the voters are saying 10. 10 out of 10, they are as motivated as they could be to vote. And that's 85% among the voters over age 50, but it's only 59% among the voters under age 50. So it's 26 points higher among older voters than younger.
And I think too, Larry, there was another question on the poll about how committed are you to vote in November? And that number even goes up higher to around 90% of the over 50, where they say we are committed to go to the polls or vote by mail in November.
Bill, is this something you hear about often from your membership, concerns about getting out there and voting, and specifically this election coming up in November? What is your sense?
Yeah, we do a lot of work at AARP about how to vote, where to vote, and when to vote. You know, it's important. You know, there was talk earlier this year about changing the primary date, which they really didn't move it up. They kept it to where it was.
Right.
But that had a lot of people on edge. Like, when is that going to happen? When are the due dates for registration to register to vote? When
everybody's timetable would have been upset.
Would have been upset on that one. So what we wanted to do was be able to calm people's fears on that one and say things are still the same. And the same thing going into the general election. The other thing is, a few years back, you know, right before the pandemic, they did institute mail-in voting. Here in Pennsylvania, which really was something new. We find that a lot of older Pennsylvanians sometimes have difficulty with this. They can't get out to the polls, so they definitely want to vote by mail. However, there's one thing you have to do, like you have to sign the inside of the ballot, and then you have to sign the envelope.
Right.
A lot of older Pennsylvanians forget
There was much controversy over that, and as a result, there were a lot of flawed ballots that were even rejected.
And that is correct. And it's important for us at AARP that everyone in the Commonwealth gets to vote. It's their right, and they need to do it, and we don't want to have any impediments on that front. So basically, we do a lot of education around the rights to vote, as well as giving people dates, important dates, and then helping them, you know, go to either our website or to the state website to figure out, like, where can I drop my ballot off ahead of time? Where are my polling places? Have they changed? Those are the kind of things that we just want to do the education and make sure that everyone gets to vote.
And plus, mobility can be a challenge, obviously, for older Pennsylvanians. So what does AARP do to help people get to the polls if they don't feel like voting by mail?
We don't do that at AARP, but what we can do is point people in the right direction. There are a lot of groups out there that are able to get people to the polls if they want to do that. What we found was during the pandemic, obviously a lot more people were voting by mail, but Pennsylvanians like to go in person, pull that lever. So we're finding that those are kind of balancing out, and there's more people, even over the age of 50, going to the polls instead of doing the mail-in ballot piece of it.
Let's consider another part of the poll here, Bob and Jeff, and it has to do with the political parties of voters that were polled. And so that can be enlightening to look at. It tells us what the balance is between Democrats and Republicans here in Pennsylvania. Jeff, would you take the lead on that, please? What did you find?
Well, Pennsylvania has been an extremely competitive state in recent elections. It's, as I said, the likeliest tipping point state. And part of the reason for that is that Pennsylvanians are relatively evenly divided between the parties. 44% are identifying as Democrats, 41% are identifying as Republicans. And then, you know, as I mentioned, you've also got a large number, almost 30% of older voters over 50, who, when we ask them who they'd vote for president, Senate, races like attorney general, don't always give you the same answer, aren't voting a straight ticket. So there's a lot of room to persuade the voters of Pennsylvania, who are, again, pretty evenly divided between the parties.
And as we were discussing earlier, some voters reported that they were independent or unaffiliated anyway, and that amounted to 13%, and that struck me as significant. How does it strike you fellas as pollsters, Bob?
Well, actually, Pennsylvania is somewhat unique in having the largest amount of registered voters to one of the two, either two major political parties. So in other states, the non-aligned voters, the independent voters, are actually bigger, and Pennsylvania is pretty unique in that way. So 13 is actually, from a relative perspective, small. But as Jeff alluded to, voters are not all sticking to their partisan sides. They jump around. We asked a number of ballots on this survey, and we had people, as Jeff said, almost 30% of those over 50 not take the straight party line down the ticket.
And what we see on the ground here in Pennsylvania is basically you have more liberal Republicans in the Philadelphia Southeast section, and more conservative Democrats out west, and it's just interesting. So yeah, they may consider themselves Democrat, but sometimes they're more conservative than their Republican counterparts in the other part of the state.
The other thing I'd point out is on the age difference, because we are focused on voters 50 plus, and voters 50 plus are more Republican than voters under 50. And so that's a fact, but they're also not monolithic. The age group 50 to 64 is very Republican. And these are the folks who grew up under Reagan. They're in the highest earning years of their life. Economic issues are paramount. And then you have the baby boomers who make up a lot of the 65 plus, and they are not as Republican as the 50 to 64-year-olds. Much more evenly divided when you get to 65 plus.
Let's talk about a question that appeared on the poll that it seems to recurs all the time, and certainly you fellas as pollsters probably have an idea of what I'm leading up to. And the question is the country going in the right direction? Jeff, what did you find there?
Well, most Pennsylvanians, like most Americans, believe that things are heading in the wrong direction. You've got almost 3/4 of Pennsylvanians who think that things are heading in the wrong direction. This has in the past been a question that helps us understand whether or not the political environment is pro or anti-incumbent. It's been a pretty sour political environment for quite a while now. And I think that one of the things that will decide the election is whether or not the president and other Democrats can convince voters who are not happy with the direction of the country, but aren't furious about it, to vote for.
I'm trying to appreciate the nuance of that statement.
Sorry?
Let's also, just one more question about that particular poll question. Since it says 73% of all the participants said the country's going in the wrong direction, and then when it goes to 50 plus voters, it was 68%. I wonder if that 5% is statistically important. Do you read anything into that, Bob?
Yeah, I do, actually, and I think it tells a little bit about what's happening in the electorate in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. Voters under 50 are significantly more sour about the direction of the country than voters over 50. Both of them clearly have majorities that think the country's heading in the wrong direction. But it's bigger among younger voters than it is among older voters, and that is weighing heavily on some of the political questions that we'll be talking about in a little bit.
And let's move on then, gentlemen, to some specific races, and we might as well start with the race for U.S. President. The question reads, if you had to choose today, who would you pick for U.S. President? And Jeff, tell us about your findings there.
Well, I think that the first thing to note is that these findings are pretty consistent with national polls. Pennsylvania tends to be about 3 points more Republican in recent elections than the country as a whole. Donald Trump has had a very small lead in national polls. And so you would expect him to be ahead by a few points in Pennsylvania, given that. And he is. He is, whether or not you ask about it with many candidates on the ballot or just ask about it as a choice between Trump and Biden, in which case he's ahead by 4 points. But there again, there are some pretty significant differences between men and women and between older and younger voters.
I wonder if, go ahead, Bill.
No,
did you draw a breath?
Yeah, I did. The other thing too, along with what Jeff was talking about, was with regards to the party line. You know, so what we found in past elections were that people did vote one party at the federal level, but when it came to the state-run seats, you know, the statewide seats, they crossed over and then they crossed back for local. So it's very interesting to see how people will vote. They'll vote one way for the, you know, the federal Senate seat, but then they'll come back and vote another way for the Attorney General's race.
Now, as you gentlemen know, polls are often referred to as a snapshot in time, and it occurs to me, as far as president is concerned, I wonder what the difference would be if a debate had already been staged between the two candidates. In fact, just the other day, both of them agreed to debates, 2 debates to be exact, and one of them is in June, which is unusually early for an election season because, as Bill pointed out before, some people aren't even paying attention to the race until about Labor Day. What do you think, Jeff? Can debates have much of an effect on changing these results?
I actually think that they can. And one of the reasons that I think that they can is that part of the challenge that Joe Biden has in a state like Pennsylvania is that he's not consolidating all of the Democrats yet. And I think that there are still some voters out there who don't accept that this is the choice, that the choice is between Biden and Trump. And I think that, you know, if you're Joe Biden, you probably want earlier debates to clarify for everybody, including some people who would naturally be inclined to vote for Democrats but aren't currently supporting the president, that this is the choice.
So it sounds, Jeff, that some voters may be going out of their way not to vote just because they don't approve of the candidates in general?
Well, I think you saw some of this expressed in the primaries. There were some voters within Democratic primaries that were voting uncommitted rather than voting for anybody. And again, what Biden is trying to do at this point is consolidate a lot of voters who did vote for him 4 years ago, but aren't saying that they're going to vote for him at this point.
One of the things I'd point out here is that, and this gets to a big question mark for, you know, what happens in November is who shows up. We talked about the vote motivation question. If you look at the 2020 exit polls by age and compare them to this poll in Pennsylvania, what you'll see is voters 50 plus, you know, we've talked about them being more Republican, and they are, and the 50 to 64-year-olds are voting for Trump by, you know, quite a bit more than than seniors. But they're relatively stable in where they were 4 years ago and where they are today in this poll. What's happened is voters under 50 have changed dramatically. So they went for Biden by 20 points in 2020 in Pennsylvania. In this poll, they're only going for Biden by 3 points. And that's a huge difference. And so the question is, will they show up? So I think to Jeff's point, you know, earlier debates could make a difference. It could go the other way too. I mean, it's everyone wants to see you've got 2 older candidates, and really how they perform in the debate, I think, is going to take sort of an outsized stage in this election.
Let's consider the race for U.S. Senate, gentlemen, and the Democrat in that race is Bob Casey. The Republican is Dave McCormick, and talk about the findings. Jeff, if you would, please.
Sure. Casey is ahead by 4 points, which is actually the same margin by which Biden is trailing in a two-way race. And one of the things that you see here also is that voters over age 50 are extremely competitive. It's 47% for Casey, 48% for McCormick, so they will be a major battleground. But Casey is also doing significantly better with voters under 50. than Joe Biden is in this survey, which is part of the reason why Casey is ahead by the same margin by which Biden trails.
And Casey is doing especially well with African Americans, according to your poll, over 50 years of age. 87%, that certainly sounds dominant. Look at McCormick. He's only 7% amongst the same group.
That's right. That's an absolutely core constituency within the Democratic Party. And Casey needs to consolidate Black voters, especially older Black voters, at that level in order to win.
Let's talk about another race, gentlemen, PA Attorney General. And by the way, let's talk about that in general first. Bill, are people in AARP watching a race like Attorney General? Is it quite as important as, say, U.S. Senate, the race we just talked about?
I think all the races are important, and how they have the impact on Pennsylvanians. The Attorney General's race this year is something that we really wanted in this poll because there's no incumbent. It's two new faces that are coming up. They just so happen to both be from York County, which I found interesting after the primary. However, the issues that are going to be impacting older Pennsylvanians really are, frauds and scams, elder abuse. Key issue areas, safety issues around the state, and I think they will play in, and they want to hear the Attorney General candidates talk about these issues, and we will be talking with these candidates, whether it's a video voter guide or whether it's going to be bringing them out, on some key issues and having them respond to them.
And it seems there's more and more potential for scams, robocalls, emails. It just seems to multiply, and it seems like it's a lot of it's a big landscape to navigate.
It is, and one of the questions, and I don't have it in front of me, and maybe Bob or Jeff can answer that, is about scams and frauds and how it's impacting at least the people that took the poll.
Yeah, let's consider that, Bob and Jeff. Just how concerned are older Pennsylvanians about that? Do you have figures on that?
Yeah,
how
absolutely.
afraid of being scammed by emails and robocalls are they?
Yeah, so we have basically 90% say they're at least somewhat concerned about frauds from scams. 62% of voters 50 plus say they're very concerned. These are really high numbers, and they are, across the board, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, and no matter your age group within the 50 plus, segment of the electorate. So this is a big issue that people are worried about. It's, and everyone gets, the phishing emails and the phone calls, so people are familiar with it.
Exactly. All right, so let's consider the race candidates in your poll then. And the question was, if you had to choose today, who would you pick for PA Attorney General? The candidates are Dave Sunday, the Republican, and Eugene DePasquale. He's the Democrat, and the numbers are pretty close there, Bob.
They are. And as Bill mentioned, I mean, this is a race where there's no incumbent. So both of these candidates are new. We went in the field the day after the Pennsylvania primary. And so I think we have to assume here that voters at this stage don't know a lot about these candidates. And you're seeing here a reflection of sort of where Pennsylvania is, which is largely evenly divided, right? You've got the Republican Sunday really only up by 1 point. You see the same dynamics across the demographic groups. Older voters are voting for Sunday by 8 points. Voters under 50 are voting for DePasquale by 9 points. There's a gender gap. Women 50 plus are about dead even, where men 50 plus are very over-indexing on the Republican candidate Sunday by 21 points. So I think it's a reflection of where sort of the baseline politics is in Pennsylvania right now.
Yeah, again, I'm drawn to a big disparity in the figures here. And again, it's amongst African Americans age 50 plus, and Dave Sunday, 9%. Then DePasquale, a whopping 75%, almost blows Sunday out of the water.
That's right. You've got a really core constituency there for Democrats among older voters, and again, I don't think that you can win as a Democrat unless you achieve those margins. But you also see some of the other big dynamics that are affecting the country showing up here, like college educated versus non-college educated, where Sunday is ahead by 12 points. with voters who don't have a four-year degree, whereas Democrats are ahead by 17 points among voters who have a college degree. Right, so they're obviously really important for Di Pasquale. But I would also just call out that this is an open seat. There's no incumbent. But even 4 years ago, when Shapiro won, he was at 50.9%. So I think that suggests that this is a race that's going to be close to the end.
Let's talk about some concerns that just often come up about election time. And I'm thinking of law and order or crime, however you wish to look at it. And was that considered on your poll, and how far did that move the needle as far as concerns for older voters? Go ahead, Jeff, you're nodding.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is that there's been a lot of reporting in the media about crime and about immigration. But when you look at the most important issue question, how much these voters are saying these issues matter, immigration comes out way ahead of crime and public safety. And part of the reason for that is that even though Republicans care about both immigration and crime and public safety, independents don't care nearly as much about crime and public safety as an issue, whereas independents look a little bit more like the Republicans in caring about immigration, which is part of the reason that that issue is higher and more salient.
What about government spending and taxes? Bill, maybe you can get us started on that. How often do you hear from membership, as far as you can tell, in an anecdotal manner? Tell me how much you've heard.
We always hear from our constituency with regards to issues that are impacting them when it comes to financial pieces. We hear about taxes across the board. We hear about food prices across the board. We hear about utility prices, property tax. So yes, when it comes to economic issues, it did not surprise me that this poll showed that it was quite high, because we constantly hear, whether it be in our town hall meetings or calls that come into our office on a consistent basis about economic and financial concerns.
And we often hear about property taxes here on PCN. So is there any constructive vote that can be cast in November that might have an effect on this?
Well, I think it's always going to be an issue that candidates need to be looking at, and you'll see more obviously on a state-wide level with our House and Senate races. That they're always going to be talking about this, because they know that that's going to be an impact on how an individual, especially a 50-plus individual, is going to be a homeowner, is going to be voting in that sense. So yes, they do talk about it. It's a hard issue to figure out, because that's why it hasn't been. They go around the edges when it comes to taxes, and especially property tax, and it's never been dealt with, because there's going to be some hard decisions when that time comes.
Bob and Jeff, I was looking at your poll about gun control, and that ranked 10% on the poll as far as important concerns were. And obviously, when we have headlines about gun violence that are fairly regular nowadays, how does that 10% figure impress you, Jeff?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, that's an issue which unfortunately tends to be sensitive to what's in the news, and it tends to rise after there's a major incident or a mass shooting. I think that you will see a lot of candidates making gun safety part of a public safety message this fall, but I don't think that in this environment it's quite as salient as some other issues. And I would actually then bring this back to where we started, which is the salience of Social Security, the salience of economic issues, the salience of family caregiving, which I think are going to ultimately matter more to the voters 50 plus, who will be a majority of the voters this fall.
Bob, how about the environment and climate change? Now, it's obvious that a lot of young people know stuff about the environment today that I never would have known about at their age. But what about older Pennsylvanians? How did that turn out on your poll as far as being an important concern is?
So the way we ask our question is, what is the most important issue that's going to decide your vote in November? And we list out about a dozen issues. And then if they pick one, we ask them what their second choice is. And the environment and climate change is near at the bottom of the list. It's just above foreign policy and military and defense. It's not to say it's not an important issue, But in the mix of other issues, it is not driving what voters are thinking about in this election, right? They're thinking about the economy. The partisans are thinking about cultural issues, on either side, and the environment and climate change just isn't cutting through those issues to these voters.
Bill, is this maybe a generational thing?
Well, from what we see, I don't know if it's a generational thing. If you ask my kids, yes, the environment and climate change is important to them.
Right.
However, I think, and Bob and Jeff have been saying this all along as well, is that when it comes to the 50 plus, especially the 65 plus, it's really about, hey, at 65 plus, I'm on a fixed income. I have to be able to afford, food and prescription drugs and utilities and staying in my home as long as possible. That concern outweighs any other concern, any other social issue concern that we've been hearing here. And it is the 65 plus that have really been pushing that. Then you have the 50 to 64-year-olds that are thinking, hey, I'm going to be in that pot soon with regards to being on a fixed income. So that's why the economy, Social Security, and key issue areas that are financial are really impactful for the 50 plus right now.
I noticed, gentlemen, that foreign policy ranked at the same figure, 6%. So fairly low concern. This is interesting, of course, given recent headlines and wars around the world.
That's right. I think that you're seeing very low salience in most polls for foreign policy. And if you, for example, ask questions, which we didn't in this survey, about the war in Gaza, you'll get a lot of Americans telling you that they just don't know, just aren't sure how they feel. You might have more than a third of Americans saying that they just don't know and are not sure. And I think that that's part of the reason why you see it so low. You see foreign policy issues so low. I think that this election is going to be decided on domestic issues, especially domestic economic issues.
Which makes me think, gentlemen, of Social Security, and I know you asked questions about that, and 17% of the respondents said that was important. And what kind of insights do we have as far as the status of Social Security today and what changes may be done to help protect it? Everybody, of course, is concerned that their Social Security, they want it to be there when they retire.
Absolutely. I mean, so not only does Social Security show up high on this sort of large laundry list of issues, and it does, especially among Black voters 50 plus, it really stands out. It's their number one issue. But when we ask people about Social Security and say, hey, is this an important issue to deciding your vote? We have 92% saying it's at least very important, and 64% saying it's extremely important. So voters 50 plus are absolutely zeroed in on Social Security. We ask it from the context of, is this something, if a candidate, supported, like making sure workers get Social Security they paid into and earned through the lifetime of hard work, would you be more or less likely to vote for that candidate? 96% said they would be more likely, 83% much more likely. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat. The issue of Social Security among voters 50 plus is huge. And if you're a campaign and you're not talking about this, you're missing an opportunity, especially if your opponent is.
And I think the other piece of that as well is on the ground, you're seeing people concerned, whether they're in their 40s or in their 50s, will Social Security be here for me? I know some people go, it's not going to be there for me. Well, I find that interesting when right now, almost 35% of individuals in Pennsylvania only have Social Security as their source of income. They don't have a pension, they don't have savings, they just are living off of Social Security. And I don't think that number is going to change with those coming up the pipe here from the 40 and 50-year-olds when they reach retirement age. So it is definitely an issue that is important to everyone to make sure that they have that part of the three-legged stool to be able to retire on.
Earlier we talked about, go ahead, Jeff, you had something to say?
Oh, I would just add that Social Security is not an abstract issue for voters over age 50. If you ask Pennsylvanians over age 50, how important Social Security will be as a source of their income in retirement, 63% say it will be a major source of their income. So again, it's not abstract, and it's not a luxury sort of supplemental income. Pennsylvanians over 50 are thinking of this as a major primary source of their income in retirement, which is why it's such a voting issue for them.
And yet it's only one leg on the stool, as I think Bill's pointing out here.
That is correct. Yeah, it's you know, and that's another thing at AARP we kind of do. It's the education aspect of it, letting people know how important it is to have some type of savings, have a 401k, have a pension plan, you know, a regular defined benefit pension plan, which there are hardly any of those out there. But making sure that people start looking at an earlier age in their 20s when they first start to go to work, to make sure that they're putting money aside. And I know people are like, hey, I have to put food on the table. I have to be able to, you know, take care of my children. I don't have time to be worrying about this. But it's, you know, you're just putting it and kicking the can down the road if you don't start thinking about it in your early 20s and 30s. And you know, by the time you're 50, it's too late.
Bill, earlier we talked about health care, so let's make it even more specific, and I'd like you to get us going on the topic of prescription drugs, because that can have a serious impact on the household budget.
That's exactly right. And again, I think it's really, when you look at the 50 plus, it's the 50 to 64-year-olds that are really more concerned because
they're taking more medications.
They're taking more medications. They're still in the workforce. Their plan may not have a prescription plan around it. It's going to cost them out of pocket. Where people that are 65 plus are on Medicare, there is Part D that they can fall back on. But it's still a concern because you're taking more and more prescriptions. It's more dollars that are coming out of your pocket. And it has always been a key issue for that, poll after poll, survey after survey, when we're asking the question.
So, Jeff, did prescription drugs figure into your poll specifically?
We didn't look as much at prescription drug prices in this survey as in some others, but I think that I'm sorry, and Bob I know will follow up, but we did ask, I think, about prescription drug prices as an issue that would motivate people to vote for a candidate.
Right.
I mean, I would also say that I think you're absolutely going to see prescription drugs feature prominently in advertisements from Democrats and Republicans this cycle.
Well, let's go back.
Yeah,
go ahead, Bob. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we did ask the question, you know, how important is the cost of prescription drugs in influencing your vote? 67% said it's at least very important, and it's you know, it's a big issue. Black voters 50 plus, that 67% rises to 86%. So it's a huge issue in older Black voters' thoughts about how they're going to vote. So it's still an issue out there that people have real concern about.
That's right. And then we also asked people what their biggest financial concern is. And among people over 50, I think 44% said that healthcare and prescription drugs were one of their top two cost concerns.
Let's go back to that list of most important issues that would determine an older voter's vote. And if you remember, it started with personal economic issues, and that was 56%. And then at the list, at least at the bottom of the list of 10 or 20 concerns, came Medicare. And I was just given the population, of course, we're concerned with on this program. I was surprised that they only clocked in at 5%, thought that was a very important issue. Bob, can you explain why that result happened?
Sure. So I think a couple of reasons why. And we talked about one of these earlier, which is, you know, there are a lot of issues on this list, and what are the things that are defining the election right now? Fortunately, Medicare isn't one of those issues that's defining the election, right? People who have it, it's working for them, but it is important to them, okay? So we asked a question separate from the long list of how important is Medicare on your vote, and we have 73% saying it's at least very important, 39% saying it's extremely important. So when you ask them, it is a big issue, but it's not something that is, you know, top of mind importance that we would say is defining what this election is about this year.
Bill, we have a few minutes left in our program, so reflecting on a lot of these things we've talked about today, what stands out to you as most interesting and maybe even surprising?
Well, I think that the most interesting pieces that I've seen are not surprising at all. It's the economic piece, as we mentioned earlier. Tabletop issues, are issues that they're going to talk about that are impacting them on a daily basis, and that is putting food on the table, the prices of food that's been going up, utilities with regards to affording utilities, with the heating, the electricity, the water rates. Right now we're involved in fighting back on a water rate increase that's going to be happening. They asked for one last year. It's covering most of the state, and it's going to be happening. They asked for another additional 80% increase, which is huge. So these are just things that are top of mind right now.
They're on every Pennsylvanian's desk every single day.
That's exactly right. It's really on top of mind on that. And then Social Security, Social Security and caregiving. Again, as was mentioned earlier, there's a large segment of the sandwich generation that are being impacted on caregiving. And
tell us what the sandwich generation is just one more time.
Sure. It's where you're at an age where you still have young children you're taking care of, and then you have an elderly parent or relative that you're also taking care of.
So the caregiver's in the middle of that sandwich.
They're sandwiched right in the middle of that. So the bottom line there is that it's impacting them. They'd like to see what supports are out there for caregivers. They want to remind people that they are caregivers, so they're working full-time jobs, taking care of their families, taking care of a loved one, and they're really just caught in that cycle. And so there's really issues being concerned about that, about what is either state government, local government, how are they helping those individuals, whether they be, tax credit issues for them that they could do there, being able to allow them to have some time away from their families. Is there anything that they can do there to have that refresher? Because if they get sick themselves, everyone else is going to be impacted by that.
Sometimes they call that respite or respite care.
Respite care, that's exactly right, yeah. So there's those issues. And then again, the economic with Social Security and issues, making sure that Social Security is there, it's viable, it's safe into the future so that they are able to be able to participate and get those dollars down.
Gentlemen, we have just a couple minutes left in our show. Bob, let's start with you. For you, what is the major takeaway from this poll you just did for AARP?
Well, just to pick up on what Bill was saying, I think Social Security is a big issue. You've heard talk in Congress about, using Social Security to do a variety of things. One of the questions we asked in this poll is, would you be more or less likely to vote for a candidate who protected Social Security from cuts that would be used to reduce the nation's debt? 78% said they'd be more likely to vote for the candidate who protected Social Security from those cuts. And guess what? And I'll say this to my fellow Republicans out there. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican, Independent, or Democrat. All Pennsylvania voters over 50, not all, but the vast majority of them would be more likely to support that candidate. 71% of Republicans 50 plus would support the candidate who would protect Social Security from those cuts. So that's a big takeaway from my side of the aisle.
How about you, Jeff? Try to tell us in about 30 seconds.
Yes, I think for me, it's definitely the strong percentage, over 80%, who said that they would be more likely to vote for a candidate who provides support to family caregivers. I can remember during the battle over passing the ACA, that was the most popular thing that ended up on the cutting room floor, but a lot of seniors are concerned with being able to age in place.
Our guests have been Bob Ward of Fabrizio Ward, Jeff List from Impact Research, and Bill Johnston Walsh, the State Director of AARP Pennsylvania. Thanks, everyone. That's it for Focus on Aging Adults. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.
Focus on Aging Adults is sponsored in part by AARP.